When Shaquille O'Neal walked past a small art stall on a crowded sidewalk, most people didn't notice. Just another passerby, just another face in the crowd. But when he stopped, his towering figure casting a shadow over the tiny paintings, and carefully lifted a canvas, everything changed. Because Sophie Carter was no ordinary artist. She didn't paint for fame or recognition. She painted to survive. And what happened next became an unforgettable moment. Because, true to Shaquille O'Neal's style, he didn't just buy a painting, he changed her future. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you love inspiring stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more amazing content. Sophie Carter sat motionless on the cold hospital bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, as if letting go would send her spiraling into an endless abyss. The fluorescent light overhead cast a pale glow, reflecting off the blank white walls. Cold, indifferent. There was nothing but the sharp scent of antiseptic, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor from the next room, and the heavy silence that pressed down on her chest. Across from her, Dr. Patel sat behind his desk, his expression serious, but his eyes held a flicker of hesitation. He adjusted his glasses, inhaling deeply as if searching for the least cruel way to say what needed to be said. But, no matter how carefully he chose his words, the truth remained unchanged. The treatment is working, but... Those last 4 words froze the air in the room. Sophie didn't need to hear the rest. She had grown used to this kind of speech, the way doctors softened their tone just before dropping a bomb that shattered their patients' worlds. But a single word, yet it always carried the worst news. Dr. Patel glanced at Sophie's parents, his eyes filled with sympathy, but sympathy did nothing to change reality. Sophie saw her mother clasp her hands together, fingers trembling. You need at least 2 more rounds of chemotherapy. But another pause. Longer this time. Sophie could see the regret in his eyes, not because the treatment was failing, but because the hospital bill would break her family before the illness ever could. The costs will be very high. A simple statement, but it landed like a death sentence. Her mother let out a quiet sob, as if the weight of the world had just collapsed on her shoulders. Her father said nothing, but Sophie saw the way his hands clenched into fists on his knees, his knuckles turning white. His eyes were distant, hollow, searching for a way out but finding nothing but dead ends. Sophie had endured many painful days in this hospital, the excruciating treatments, the relentless nausea, the nights spent sleepless from anxiety. But never had she felt as hopeless as she did now. Not because of the illness, not because of death, but because she was the reason her family was falling apart. They had sold almost everything to pay for her treatments. Their savings, their insurance, their belongings, even her father's car, gone. And now, what was left? She couldn't bear to look at them, because if she did, she would see the helplessness in her father's gaze, the anguish in her mother's eyes, and she couldn't handle that. She bit her lip, willing herself not to cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't, but when her mother gently took her hand, her fingers trembling, Sophie's defenses cracked. Her mother had always been the strong one, the one who smiled no matter what. But today, she couldn't hide her fear. Sophie couldn't stand it any longer. She couldn't let them drown in debt because of her. She wouldn't let them fall. She couldn't. Dr. Patel sighed, offering some words of comfort. But Sophie didn't hear them. Her mind held only one question. How do I save my family? Outside the window, the evening sun faded, leaving behind a sky of muted gray. But Sophie knew she couldn't just sit there, waiting for the light to return. She had to find her own way. The pale moonlight streamed through the window, stretching across the cold floor, casting faint, wavering shadows on the ceiling in rhythm with Sophie's slow, uneven breaths. She lay motionless on the bed, eyes wide open, her mind blank, yet so unbearably heavy that even lifting her head felt impossible. Thoughts tangled and twisted around each other, wrapping her consciousness in an invisible rope, tightening, cutting deeper with every passing second. Outside in the hallway, the steady hum of a rolling cart echoed over the tiled floor, blending with the distant voices of nurses changing shifts. But none of it made the suffocating atmosphere any lighter. If she kept living like this, if her parents kept pouring every last cent they had into a desperate, fragile hope, then even if she survived, would she ever have the courage to look them in the eye without feeling like a burden? She shut her eyes, trying to push those thoughts away, but they clung to her like an undertow, pulling her deeper into a sea of despair. She turned over, her gaze unconsciously drifting toward the old wooden desk in the corner of her room, where unfinished paintings lay scattered among dried-out tubes of paint. And then a thought sparked. Small, almost imperceptible, but powerful enough to make her sit up with a start. Art. It wasn't just a passion. It was her world, the only place where she could escape the cruel reality pressing down on her. Ever since she was a child, she had found peace in every brushstroke, a sense of freedom in the colors she brought to life. But now, it couldn't just be an escape. If she could turn these paintings into money, if she could sell them, then maybe, just maybe, she could fight her own battle. The idea was crazy, but in the darkness surrounding her, it was the only light. She reached for an unfinished canvas, her fingertips grazing the rough, dried texture of the paint. What was a painting, really? Just fabric with a mix of random colors? Or a story? A soul that someone out there might understand? If others could sell their art, why couldn't she? If life had pushed her into a corner, then she would carve out her own way forward. She had to do something before it was too late, but not everyone believed in dreams. The next day, when she told her parents about her plan, her mother fell silent, eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. She didn't want her daughter sitting outside all day under the scorching sun, amidst the rushing crowds where few would even bother to care. But Sophie was determined. She didn't wait for approval, because this time she knew what she had to do. She couldn't hesitate any longer. Under the blistering sun, she and her mother set up a small art stall on a busy street. A simple wooden table, a stand to display her paintings, and a hand-painted sign written in neat yet slightly trembling strokes. Original artwork helping fund chemotherapy. Everything was ready, but reality was harsher than she had imagined. The entire morning passed, and people only glanced at her paintings in passing. A few stopped briefly, then walked away. A well-dressed, middle-aged woman examined one canvas with mild interest, but the moment Sophie named a price, she scoffed, shook her head, and left. A businessman in an expensive suit glanced at the sign, shrugged, and walked off without a word. No one cared. The sun climbed higher, heat rising in waves from the pavement. Sophie felt lightheaded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as sweat trickled down her temple. But she kept smiling whenever someone glanced her way. Yet all she received were looks of pity. Then a man stopped, but he wasn't like the others. He wasn't interested in the art, nor did he look like a potential buyer. He wore a worn-out leather jacket, his hair cropped short, and behind his dark sunglasses there was a sharp, unreadable gaze. He smirked. "Kid, you really think anyone cares about paintings these days? Who the hell would waste money on this?" Sophie looked up, meeting his stare but saying nothing. He stepped closer, bending slightly as he read her sign aloud, each word dripping with mockery. "Helpin' fund chemotherapy." Then he laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the crowded street. "Listen, kid, if you really need money, stop wasting your time. No one's going to pay for a dying girl's art. If I were you, I'd find a more practical way." Silence fell. People nearby had started to notice. A few threw Sophie uncertain glances, sympathy flickering in their eyes, but no one spoke up. A storm of anger surged inside her, but she refused to let it explode. She didn't need to prove anything to him. She took a slow breath, her voice steadier than she expected when she finally spoke. "I don't need your advice. I just need to fight." The man raised an eyebrow, momentarily surprised. Then he scoffed again, smirking before turning and walking away. Sophie watched him go, but she didn't feel anger anymore. She felt fire. She knew this road wouldn't be easy. She knew the world wasn't kind. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she wouldn't stop. She picked up a brush, dipped it into the paint, and began to create. No matter what they said, no matter how many turned away, she would make her own miracles. The early morning breeze swept across the stone-paved sidewalk, carrying a faint chill of dawn, but Sophie didn't feel it. She stood before the small art stand she had just set up, her eyes carefully scanning every detail. She adjusted the position of the paintings, smoothed the edges of the wooden sign, and stepped back to take in the full view. Everything was ready. But would anyone stop? Her gaze flickered to her mother, standing beside her, gripping the handle of her purse as if it were an unconscious reflex. Though she had reluctantly agreed to let Sophie come here, the worry on her face was unmistakable. She had never wanted her daughter to face the harsh realities of the world, never wanted Sophie to expose herself under the glaring sun, just for the faint hope of a fragile chance. But when Sophie looked at her, eyes unwavering, filled with a determination that could not be swayed, her mother knew that no amount of protest would stop her. The sun rose higher, and the midday light cast shadows against the towering buildings. The street pulsed with life, a symphony of hurried footsteps, distant car horns, and indistinct chatter forming an unpredictable rhythm. Sophie sat on a folding chair, watching the endless stream of people passing by her stand. Most of them didn't even glance her way. A few let their gaze linger for a brief second before looking away, as if they had accidentally stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see. A man in a suit stared at a painting for a moment, his lips pressed into a thin line as though deep in thought. But then, with a shrug, he walked away without a word. A middle-aged woman in an expensive dress paused briefly, but instead of buying a painting, she only left behind a fleeting look of pity before disappearing into the crowd. Sophie's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her nails pressing into the rough wood. She had prepared for this, had known that not everyone would care, that not everyone would stop and reach for their wallets, but knowing it didn't make the disappointment any less heavy. 4 hours passed. Her stomach clenched with hunger, her head spun from exhaustion. The fatigue from her latest chemotherapy session still clung to her like a weighted blanket, dragging her down inch by inch. She reached for the water bottle beside her, but just as she twisted the cap open, a voice broke through the air. "Sweetheart, how much for this painting?" Startled, Sophie looked up. An elderly couple stood before her. The woman, wearing a beige sweater, had silver-gray hair neatly pulled back. Her eyes sparkled with interest as she gazed at a painting of a fiery sunset. Beside her, the man nodded gently, his kind face partially hidden behind reading glasses. Sophie swallowed hard, her heart hammering as she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. $80. There was no hesitation, no pitying glances like the others. The woman simply smiled, reached into her purse, and handed Sophie the money. The man carefully lifted the painting, cradling it as if it were something precious, and together they walked away, vanishing into the bustling street. Sophie stared at the bills in her hand, feeling as though she was holding something far more valuable than just a piece of paper. Her first painting had been sold. She clutched the money tightly, taking a deep breath. No one knew what this painting meant to her. No one knew that it was more than just colors on canvas. It was a glimmer of hope in the darkness, a small but powerful step in the battle she was fighting. No one knew that just one painting sold was enough to help her stand a little taller, to keep painting, to keep fighting, but she knew. And she knew she had to keep going. Yet the world was not made up of only kind souls. Not long after the elderly couple left, a familiar shadow loomed over her stand. Sophie looked up, and her stomach twisted the moment she recognized the man standing there. The same man who had mocked her the day before. He crossed his arms, a smirk curling at the corner of his lips. The sunglasses he wore did little to hide the disdain in his expression as he trailed his fingers along the edge of a painting, as if assessing its worth. "So, you're still at it, huh?" His voice was laced with amusement. "How many have you sold? 1? 2? Or was it just another act of charity from some rich do-gooders?" Sophie felt a tightness in her chest, but she refused to let her anger rise. She had learned that not everyone would be on her side, that not everyone believed in something good. "I don't need charity," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I just need to sell my paintings." The man let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Listen, kid, the world doesn't work like that. People don't buy paintings because they're beautiful or meaningful. They buy them for names, and you don't have one." He stepped back, arms still crossed, his smirk never fading. "If you want to make money, forget about this. You can't trade your life for a few nameless paintings." Sophie's throat tightened, but she didn't reply. She just looked at him, steadfast, unmoving, because she knew he was wrong. The world might not be fair, but she wouldn't let anyone dictate her fate. He might believe her paintings were worthless, that she had no chance among the millions of others out there, but she didn't need everyone. She just needed one person to believe in them. And she believed that day would come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it would come. She lowered her gaze, picked up her paintbrush, and continued painting. No matter what anyone said, no matter how many turned away, she would create her own miracles. Sophie kept sitting on the sidewalk every day, despite the scorching sun burning her skin, despite the constant dizziness from the side effects of chemotherapy. She didn't allow herself to rest, didn't allow herself to collapse, because every passing second was a race against time, a battle she couldn't afford to lose. Every morning, she carefully arranged her paintings, adjusted the worn-out wooden sign that had begun to fade, and then sat waiting, hoping that today someone would stop, that someone would look at a painting, not with pity, but with genuine appreciation. But it rarely happened. People passed by as if she were just an invisible part of the bustling street. Some stopped, glanced at the brushstrokes, then shook their heads and walked away, leaving behind a cold silence. Occasionally, there were those who showed sympathy, soft sighs, hollow words of encouragement, but when Sophie mentioned the price of a painting, they only shrugged and left without a second glance. Disappointment crept into her mind like an invisible chill, clinging to every thought, every feeling. But even so, she couldn't stop. Every day she still came, still sat there, still painted, because she knew that somewhere in this sea of strangers, someone would see her. Someone would see what she had poured into every stroke of her brush. And then, on a sweltering afternoon, as Sophie rested her chin on the table, trying to push away the dizziness, a gentle yet curious voice spoke right in front of her. "Did you paint these?" Sophie looked up, slightly surprised by the unexpected presence of the woman before her. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark brown hair tied up high and bright eyes that held genuine interest, not the fleeting curiosity of passers-by. A camera hung around her neck, and in her hand was a small notebook. "Yes, I did," Sophie replied, straightening up as best she could. The woman studied her for a moment, then glanced at the paintings, her gaze lingering on one in particular, a painting of a girl standing under the night sky, soft brushstrokes forming a shimmering galaxy, reflecting loneliness laced with hope. "I'm Megan, a journalist," the young woman said, extending her hand. "I run a small art blog where I seek out hidden talents." Sophie hesitated briefly before taking her hand, feeling the warmth and sincerity in her grip. "Can I hear your story?" Megan asked, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp with a journalist's instinct. Sophie took a deep breath, then began to speak. She talked about the months in the hospital, the pain, the mounting medical bills her parents had struggled to pay. She talked about her decision to sell paintings, about the indifferent glances, the dismissive comments, and the small but meaningful moments, like the first time someone bought her artwork without hesitation. Megan listened intently, sometimes jotting down notes, sometimes snapping photos of the paintings. When Sophie finished, the young woman was silent for a moment before offering a small smile. "People need to hear this," she said, her voice firm, as if she had just made an important decision. Sophie blinked, unsure how to react. She wasn't used to someone actually wanting to tell her story, wasn't used to the idea that what she did was meaningful enough to be heard. "I'm going to write about you, share it on my blog. Who knows? It might help." Sophie didn't dare hope too much, but she nodded, offering a small smile, still doubtful about the miracle Megan seemed to believe in. The next morning, when Sophie returned to her sidewalk gallery, she noticed something different. People weren't just passing by like before. Some stopped, really stopped, not out of curiosity, not out of pity. They looked at the paintings longer, and in their eyes there was something new, a genuine interest. A young woman stood in front of the display, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a canvas, her gaze thoughtful. "I read about you on the blog this morning," she said, looking up at Sophie with a smile. "Your story is inspiring. I'd love to buy a painting." Sophie's heart tightened in her chest, but this time not from anxiety. It was warmth spreading slowly, filling spaces she hadn't realized were empty. Not long after, a couple approached. They had read the article too. They wanted to support her. And then, like a ripple effect, one by one, more people came. Each pair of eyes held respect. Each voice carried questions no longer laced with indifference. And amidst it all, there was something Sophie didn't know. Megan's article wasn't just circulating on her small blog. It had begun to spread across social media, on art forums, even catching the attention of larger news outlets. Somewhere, far beyond this little sidewalk stall, complete strangers were reading about her. They were pausing in front of their computer screens, their phones, and among them there were those who wouldn't just read and move on. Some of them would come. Some of them would change her life. And she had no idea that at this very moment, one of them was already on their way to meet her. The next morning, Sophie had never imagined that her tiny art stand would become so crowded. From the moment she stepped onto the familiar sidewalk, people were already waiting. A middle-aged woman with carefully curled hair adjusted her glasses as soon as she spotted Sophie. "You're Sophie, right? I read the article about you. I want to buy a painting." Sophie froze for a brief second, her eyes widening in surprise. She nodded, quickly stepping forward to flip through her paintings for the woman to choose from. But before she could say much more, another person approached. Then another, and another. "I saw the article on Facebook. I really admire you. Your story is truly inspiring. Do you take custom orders? How much is this painting? I want to buy it right now." The storm had begun. Megan's blog post was spreading faster than even she had expected. Several local news sites had picked up the story, and hundreds of comments flooded social media. People were talking about Sophie as a phenomenon, a young artist refusing to surrender to fate, using her art to fight against adversity. And now, that wave of attention had reached her tiny art stand. With every passing minute, more people arrived. A married couple bought 2 paintings at once. A young man, still in his office uniform, stared at a painting of the city at night and let out a deep sigh, as if it stirred something within him. He didn't ask for the price. He just nodded, pulled out his wallet, and handed over the money. Sophie was so busy she barely had time to breathe. Wrapping paintings, accepting payments, offering grateful smiles, then moving on to the next customer. At first, her mother had been stunned by the overwhelming scene, but she quickly jumped in to help. The paintings disappeared from the racks so fast that Sophie could hardly believe her eyes. Within 2 hours, she had sold more artwork than she had in the entire previous week. But that wasn't the most shocking part. A short distance away, inside a nearby cafe, a man sat silently by the window, a laptop open before him. The screen glowed with the now viral article, the story of Sophie Carter, the young woman using her art to battle cancer. The man narrowed his eyes, scrolling through the flood of comments beneath the article. "This is so touching. She's so strong. I want to support her. Her art is beautiful. I'm going to order one." A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, though his eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, remained cold. He was the same man who had mocked Sophie before, the one who had scoffed at her on her first day, the one who had sneered, "No one's going to buy art from a nobody." And now he was witnessing his mistake, but not in a way that made him feel guilty. Instead, it made him feel something else, something he couldn't tolerate. He had never believed in stories like this, ordinary people suddenly becoming famous overnight because of a single article, a single click, a fleeting wave of public sympathy. To him, all of it was just another temporary craze, a sentimental trend that would be replaced by a new story within a week. And he hated that. He took a slow sip of coffee, his gaze flickering back to the screen. If Sophie kept gaining momentum like this, who knew what would happen next. She could receive exhibition offers, sponsorships. She could actually change her life. And that meant he had been wrong. He didn't like being wrong. He shut his laptop, his jaw tightening as a dangerous thought surfaced in his mind. If Sophie had risen with just one article, she could just as easily be taken down with another. Meanwhile, back at the art stand, Sophie was still unaware that her world was about to change once again, only this time in an entirely different way. Amid the bustling crowd, a man approached the stand. He was tall, his shoulders broad like a fortress. He wasn't like the others. He didn't look eager to buy a painting. He wasn't holding up his phone to take pictures. He wasn't chatting excitedly about the article. He wasn't scanning the paintings with the intention to purchase. He simply stood there, silent, observing, as if weighing something far more important than a simple transaction. Sophie didn't notice him at first. She was too busy helping customers, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, but her smile unwavering. But then, as if sensing an unusual energy rippling through the crowd, she instinctively turned her head. And when her eyes met his, the world seemed to slow, freezing in a breathless instant. He was taller than anyone she had ever seen, his massive frame built like a professional athlete. His face was calm, but there was something deeply familiar, something powerful, something overwhelming. Sophie felt her heart skip a beat, because she knew who he was. Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball legend. This man hadn't just come to buy a painting. He had come to change her life. The afternoon sun cast its blazing rays onto the stone-paved sidewalk, where Sophie's tiny art stall remained busy with passing customers. The hum of conversations, the rustling of wrapping paper, and the distant roar of traffic blended into a chaotic symphony. Strangely enough, in that very moment, she felt a sense of peace. It had been a long time since she had felt anything remotely close to hope, but just as she handed a painting to a customer and wiped the sweat from her forehead, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. A massive shadow eclipsed the sunlight, stretching over her stall like a mysterious, looming wall. The people around her froze. Some customers looked up, their faces reflecting sheer astonishment. Sophie felt an inexplicable energy ripple through the air, something that made her heartbeat quicken. Slowly, she straightened up, shielding her eyes from the reflected glare, and looked up. The man stood towering in front of her, 7 feet 1 inch tall, with shoulders as broad as a fortress. He wore a simple black hoodie, but even that couldn't conceal his overwhelming presence. His enormous sneakers, something not just anyone could wear, planted firmly on the ground, as if he had been standing there forever. Sophie held her breath. That face, that gaze. Then his deep, steady voice broke through the surrounding noise. "Did you paint all these?" 5 words, and yet it felt like time had just stopped. The murmurs around them grew. People started recognizing him. A young woman gasped and covered her mouth. A boy holding his phone yanked his earbuds out and turned to his friend, whispering in awe, "Oh my God, that's Shaquille O'Neal." Sophie stood there, unable to say anything. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. This couldn't be real. A basketball legend, a man who had once dominated the court, whose name had echoed across the world, a figure so monumental that his mere presence could silence an entire crowd. And now he was standing in front of her tiny art stall. It took Sophie a few seconds to find her voice. "Yes, I did," she managed to say. Shaq nodded slowly, his eyes scanning each painting, unhurried, deliberate. Unlike most passers-by who glanced briefly and moved on, he truly looked. It was as if he was trying to feel every brushstroke, every shade, every meaning woven into the artwork. The air around them grew still. The people nearby barely dared to breathe, afraid to disturb the moment. A few had already discreetly pulled out their phones, recording this rare sight. A basketball legend, standing in the middle of an ordinary street, admiring the paintings of an unknown artist. Sophie stood motionless, every second stretching into eternity. Then, Shaq's gaze stopped at one particular painting. A landscape, a lone figure standing in the vast desert, the fiery hues of sunset stretching endlessly behind them. The figure was small, yet resilient, as if ready to face the world, no matter the obstacles ahead. Shaq reached out, gently lifting the painting. He tilted it slightly, letting the light catch its details. And for a fleeting moment, Sophie could have sworn she saw something in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition, as if he saw a part of himself in it. He turned to her, a faint smile playing on his lips, and asked in that deep, resonant voice, "How much for this one?" Sophie opened her mouth, but she didn't know what to say. Her mind was a blur of emotions, shock, disbelief, and something close to surreal astonishment. Shaquille O'Neal wanted to buy her painting? She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to steady her voice. $200. Shaq nodded. No hesitation, but instead of pulling out his wallet, he reached into his hoodie and took out a checkbook. Sophie froze. Nobody used checks anymore. The crowd stirred. A middle-aged man standing nearby raised an eyebrow, trying to peek at what Shaq was writing. A young woman covered her mouth as soon as she caught a glimpse of the number. Sophie's hands trembled as she accepted the check. She looked down, and in the next second, everything around her disappeared. Her breath hitched. It wasn't $200. It wasn't even $2,000. It was $50,000. The world around her blurred. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the paper as if it might vanish if she didn't hold on tight enough. The crowd erupted. A small scream pierced the air. A man nearby gawked, his mouth hanging open. A young guy practically shouted, "Shaq just paid 50 grand for a painting." The entire street exploded with excitement. People gasped, students yelled in disbelief, and dozens of phones shot up to capture the moment. But in the middle of all the chaos, Shaq remained perfectly calm. He hadn't done it for attention. It wasn't about making a scene. He had simply seen a beautiful painting, seen someone fighting for their dreams with everything they had, and he decided to help. Sophie looked up at him, eyes glistening, lips quivering as she struggled to form words. Shaq met her gaze, gave her a warm, knowing smile, and said just one thing. "This isn't charity. It's a damn good painting." And with those words, he didn't just buy a piece of art. He changed her life. Sophie's hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the edge of the check, her eyes unable to tear away from the neatly written number. $50,000. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding, her mind spinning as if she had just stepped onto a boat in the middle of a storm. A part of her wanted to believe this was some kind of bizarre joke, some sort of mistake. But Shaquille O'Neal's calm gaze showed no signs of jest. The giant man stood there, one hand casually tucked into the pocket of his black hoodie, the other having just cleanly ripped the check from the book, as if this were nothing more than a routine transaction, something he had done thousands of times before. But for Sophie, this was anything but routine. She took a deep breath, struggling to find her voice amidst the chaos surging in her chest. Are you sure? Shaq raised an eyebrow slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting into a knowing smirk. Kid, I don't do things I'm not sure about. His voice was deep, steady, completely unwavering, a quiet yet undeniable confidence, the kind that made Sophie realize this was not an impulsive act or a fleeting whim of a celebrity. He had thought this through. He had chosen this painting, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Yet Sophie still felt like she couldn't breathe. $50,000. That number was far beyond anything she had ever dared to dream of. It wasn't just money. It was salvation. It was the chance to continue her treatment. It was the lifeline that could pull her parents out of the financial nightmare that had been suffocating them every single day. A crowd had formed at some point. Stunned expressions, hushed whispers rippling through them like small waves across a vast ocean. Some craned their necks to get a better look at the check in her hand, as if needing to confirm with their own eyes that this was really happening. A woman clasped her hands over her mouth, shaking her head in disbelief. A young man nearby blurted out, unable to contain himself, "Did he really just pay 50 grand for a painting?" The murmurs spread like wildfire, and then, suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. Sophie felt it. A subtle but powerful shift in the energy of the crowd, like the first tremors before an earthquake. The people who had once walked past her booth with indifference, who had never even glanced her way, were now looking at her differently. Her worth had changed. Not because they suddenly understood her story, not because they could now see the passion woven into every brushstroke, but because a famous man had validated her. That truth stung, but she didn't have time to dwell on it, because in the next instant, something she had never imagined happening actually happened. A middle-aged man, who had previously just been standing in the background, suddenly stepped forward. "I'll take this one," he said, pointing to another painting. Before she could even process it, a young woman eagerly moved in beside him. "I want one too." Then, like a domino effect, everything exploded. "I'll buy one. Do you have any landscape paintings?" "Miss, I want to place an order." Sophie was nearly drowned in the frenzy that erupted right in front of her tiny art booth. The paintings that no one had even glanced at before were now being snatched up. No longer were they asking out of pity. No longer were they shaking their heads and walking away. Now they were rushing to buy. Her mother, who had been standing behind her all this time, finally snapped out of her shock and hurried to help wrap the paintings. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from sheer emotion. Bills and credit cards were handed over in rapid succession. Transactions happened so fast, Sophie could barely keep up. In less than 15 minutes, every single painting she had brought that day was sold out. Unbelievable. No one could believe it. Some customers who arrived too late looked visibly disappointed, but instead of walking away, they started placing orders. They asked about new paintings Sophie could create. A woman pulled out a business card from her wallet, handing it to Sophie with an eager smile. "I run an art gallery. If you have more pieces, call me. I'd love to display them in my shop." A man, who looked like an amateur collector, studied Sophie with newfound interest. "Would you be open to negotiating some exclusive pieces?" Sophie felt like her entire world was spinning. This can't be real. Just an hour ago, she had been an unknown artist, sitting by the sidewalk, selling paintings that nobody cared about. And now she was a phenomenon. And it was all because of a single moment, A single decision from the towering man still standing before her. She looked up at Shaq, who remained in place as the storm of excitement swirled around them. He simply smiled, nodded at her as if to say, "I told you, it was a great painting." Then, with a casual motion, he stuffed his hands into his pockets, turned, and disappeared into the flow of people on the street, leaving Sophie standing there at the very center of a hurricane she had never seen coming. But before she could even begin to make sense of it all, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. A shadow, a man with dark sunglasses, the one who had mocked her before. He was watching, closely. He didn't say a word, but his lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk, and in his eyes, something dangerous had begun to take shape. Because he knew the game had only just begun. Sophie stood frozen in the midst of the chaos, her fingers gripping the edge of the check so tightly that they were starting to go numb. She still couldn't fully grasp what had just happened before her eyes. An hour ago, she was just a street artist, selling paintings on the sidewalk while most people walked past without so much as a glance. But now, she was at the center of a storm, one whose power she couldn't yet comprehend. A man standing nearby, still in shock, mumbled to himself, but his voice was loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Dear God, he just paid $50,000 for a painting." That sentence was like a spark igniting a barrel of gunpowder, triggering a frenzy unlike anything Sophie had ever witnessed. Within seconds, people surged toward her makeshift gallery, no longer hesitant or indifferent, but desperate, urgent, and filled with a mixture of excitement and greed. A woman in a dark blue dress, who had been observing from a distance, suddenly pushed her way to the front, her voice shaking with excitement. "I'll take one. Do you have any left?" A young man, probably an office worker just getting off his shift, adjusted his glasses hastily while pulling out his wallet. "Miss, sell me one now." Another man, who had likely stopped out of mere curiosity, suddenly panicked when he saw the others scrambling to buy. The fear of missing out gripped him, convincing him that if he didn't act fast, he'd lose something incredibly valuable. Sophie could see the shift in their eyes. Just moments ago, they had looked at her paintings with skepticism, sometimes even pity, but now they no longer saw them as mere pieces of art. They saw them as investments, as high-value commodities validated by someone powerful. She heard voices rising from every direction. "Shaq just paid $50,000 for a painting. If I buy one now, who knows how much it'll be worth in the future?" If someone like him recognizes her talent, she must be a serious artist. "I need one immediately. This could be a masterpiece worth millions in a few years." The frenzy kept escalating, spreading like wildfire, dragging everyone into its whirlwind. Sophie felt her breathing quicken as she gripped the edge of her table, trying to stay grounded amid the crowd pressing in on her. Her mother, who had been silent ever since Shaquille O'Neal left, was struggling to keep up with the sheer speed of what was unfolding. Her eyes were wide, a mix of shock and emotion swirling within them. But when she saw Sophie nearly paralyzed by the overwhelming rush, she took a deep breath, reached for her daughter's hand, and gave it a firm squeeze. "Sophie, focus. We can handle this." Her mother's voice was steady, a lifeline in the middle of the storm. Sophie looked into her mother's eyes, seeing the same unwavering determination she had always admired. It grounded her, helping her regain a sliver of composure. She quickly turned her attention back to the eager buyers, trying to manage them as efficiently as possible. The paintings flew off the display faster than she could keep track. Within 15 minutes, nearly everything she had brought with her that day was gone. But it still wasn't enough. "Do you have any more paintings? I'll place an order," a middle-aged man called out, his face filled with anticipation. "I want a custom piece. Can you do that?" a woman interjected, her voice urgent, as if afraid she'd miss out if she didn't act fast enough. "Do you have a website? I want to buy online." A young man, probably an investor, eagerly held up his phone. Sophie could barely believe what she was hearing. Just yesterday, she'd been worrying about whether she could sell even one more painting, and now, people were fighting over the chance to buy anything she could create. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, something caught her eye in the distance. Amid the crowd swarming her booth, a familiar figure stood across the street, silent and still. He wasn't part of the chaos. He was simply watching. The man with the dark sunglasses, the one who had once mocked her. He wasn't rushing to buy a painting like the others. He wasn't excited or awed by what was happening. Instead, he stood with his hands tucked into the pockets of his leather jacket, a slight smirk on his lips. But his eyes were calculating. He had seen everything. He had watched Sophie when no one knew her name, when she was ignored, when he told her no one cared about a girl selling paintings on the sidewalk. And now, he was watching her become a phenomenon. But there was no admiration in his gaze, no surprise. Instead, there was something else, something dangerous, something Sophie couldn't quite name. He held her gaze for a few more seconds, then silently turned and disappeared into the crowd. A chill ran down Sophie's spine. She had just taken the biggest step of her life, but in that moment she felt an unsettling sense that something was wrong, and she had no idea that this storm was only just beginning. Sophie Carter had never imagined that in just one night her world could change completely. Everything happened too fast, too intensely, like a storm crashing in, sweeping away everything in a way she had never thought possible. The image of Shaquille O'Neal standing in front of her small art booth, holding the landscape painting he had chosen, along with the moment he handed over a $50,000 check, spread like wildfire across social media. The photos and videos were shared millions of times within hours. Sophie's story was no longer just a small feature on an art blog. It had become a phenomenon. Sophie was everywhere. Major news outlets started covering her. At first, it was just local newspapers, but within a day, national media had picked up the story. Headlines flooded across platforms. "Incredible story. Shaquille O'Neal spends $50,000 on painting by a young artist battling cancer. USA Today. Unknown artist becomes an overnight sensation after NBA legend buys her painting for an unbelievable price." The New York Times. From the sidewalk to the gallery, the extraordinary journey of Sophie Carter, BBC Arts. Everything exploded. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with an overwhelming number of messages, calls, and emails from everywhere. People who had once walked past her booth without a second glance were now scrambling to find information about her, desperate to buy her paintings before they became too expensive or completely unavailable. She no longer had to look for customers. Now, customers were looking for her. Within just 24 hours, Sophie's inbox was flooded with thousands of orders from around the world. "I want to buy one of your paintings. Do you take commissions? Your story has inspired me. I want one of your artworks in my home. How much do your paintings cost? I'm willing to pay any price to own one." The numbers were mind-blowing. 500 emails by the first morning, 2,000 by the evening, and the count kept rising. She could no longer keep up with reading them all. But among the overwhelming flood of messages, one email made her stop in her tracks. From Madison Gallery, New York. Subject, invitation to exhibit your work. Sophie's fingers trembled as she clicked on the message. Dear Sophie, we are Madison Gallery, one of New York's premier art exhibition venues. We have been following your story and are deeply impressed by your talent and resilience. We would love to showcase your work in our upcoming exhibition. If you're interested, please contact us as soon as possible. Best regards, Amanda Sterling, Art Director, Madison Gallery. Sophie couldn't believe her eyes. She had always thought she would remain just a sidewalk artist, relying on the kindness of strangers to continue her treatments. But now, a prestigious gallery in New York, the heart of the art world, wanted to feature her work? It was beyond her wildest dreams. She looked up at her mother, emotions swirling in her eyes, excitement, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of wonder. Mom, they want to exhibit my paintings. Her mother froze mid-motion in the middle of cleaning up Sophie's now empty art booth and stared at her daughter as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. What did you say? Sophie held up her phone screen. Her mother's eyes scanned the words, and in that moment, Sophie saw her hands tremble slightly. Not out of fear, not out of worry, but out of pride. However, while Sophie was still basking in the shock of the incredible opportunities unfolding before her, she had no idea that not everyone was happy about her success. Somewhere else in the city, in a dimly lit cafe with a yellow glow, a man wearing dark sunglasses sat in front of a laptop, his expression darkening as he read the headlines. He saw the numbers, millions of views, thousands of shares, endless praise for the young artist whom he had dismissed not long ago, claiming that no one cares about a girl selling paintings on the street. And yet, now, Sophie Carter was becoming a star in the art world, and he hated it. He had never believed in stories like this, of nobodies becoming overnight sensations. To him, the world didn't work that way. He took a slow sip of coffee, his sharp eyes scanning the screen, and in his mind, a sinister idea began to take shape. If someone could be lifted up by a story, they could also be torn down by one. He unlocked his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and stopped at a familiar name. Tabloid journalists, sensational media, people who would twist the truth for the sake of a scandal. He dialed the number. The phone rang a few times before someone answered. I have a story about that girl, a story you might be very interested in. Leaning back in his chair, a cold smirk spread across his lips. If Sophie Carter thought she could rise this easily, she was wrong. He was going to make sure she paid the price. Sophie's footsteps echoed softly against the gleaming marble floor of the hospital, each step steady but carrying a completely different weight than before. No more fear, no more despair pressing down on her chest. No more cold conversations with doctors about treatment costs or how much time she had left. Today, she wasn't here for chemotherapy. She was here to finish it. She stopped at the reception desk, where a familiar nurse looked up upon seeing her. The middle-aged woman offered a warm smile, her eyes filled with genuine happiness. Not out of duty, but because she had witnessed Sophie's journey from the very beginning, back when she was just a frail, pale young girl, burdened with a weight no 19-year-old should ever have to carry. Today's the last day, isn't it? The nurse asked, her voice filled with tenderness. Sophie nodded and smiled, but her throat tightened so much that she couldn't speak right away. Silently, the nurse slid a file across the counter. Neatly stacked white sheets, stamped with confirmation that all of Sophie's medical expenses had been paid in full, with the money she had earned from her own paintings. Sophie carefully flipped through the pages, her fingers brushing over the bolded headers of each bill. Those numbers had once been a noose hanging over her head, the same numbers that had driven her family to the brink of hopelessness. But now, they were nothing more than the past. A quiet, relieved sigh escaped her lips, a feeling of liberation she had never truly believed she would experience. "You did it, Sophie." She turned around and saw her mother standing there, eyes red-rimmed but her face glowing with pride. Her father stood beside her, his hand resting gently on his wife's shoulder, as if neither of them could fully believe this moment was real. They had done it. They had fought together, endured the darkest days, faced moments when the future seemed like an endless tunnel with no way out. Yet somehow, through a resilience she hadn't even known she possessed, Sophie had survived. She had beaten cancer. But as she stepped out of the hospital doors, inhaling the crisp evening air, she realized that the world outside had changed along with her. Just a month ago, she had been an unknown artist, sitting on the sidewalk with a tiny makeshift booth, struggling to sell even a single painting, desperately trying to scrape together enough money to continue treatment. But now, she was no longer just another street artist. Among the towering buildings around her, a massive LED screen was playing a short video. Shaquille O'Neal standing in front of her small art booth, holding a $50,000 check in his hand, nodding at her in silent recognition. Beneath it, a headline scrolled across the screen. The inspiring story of Sophie Carter, when art triumphs over adversity. Sophie shook her head slightly, smiling to herself. She had never imagined that one day her name would appear on a billboard in the middle of the city, that her face would be featured on morning news shows, or that she would receive invitations from prestigious galleries across the country. She had once only wanted to sell enough paintings to survive, but now she was truly living. However, not everyone was celebrating her victory. Somewhere else, far from the hospital, a man wearing dark sunglasses sat in a dimly lit bar, his fingers tapping lightly against his glass of whiskey. In front of him, his phone screen displayed an article about Sophie. His brows furrowed as he scrolled through the words of praise. Sophie Carter, a young artist rising from hardship. From a street art booth to the star of the art world. With a frustrated sigh, he tossed his phone onto the table. He didn't understand why people cared so much about this girl. He had once believed that she would never sell a single painting, that the world would never notice someone as insignificant as her. But he had been wrong. So wrong that it made his blood boil. Sophie Carter wasn't just famous, she was becoming a symbol, and that irritated him more than anything. Reaching for his phone again, he scrolled through his contacts and made a call. After a few rings, a cold, professional voice answered on the other end. "Have we found anything yet?" There was a brief hesitation before the reply came. "Nothing too serious, but there are a few angles we can exploit. If we spin the story the right way, public opinion will do the rest." The man in sunglasses smirked, raising his glass to his lips, but his eyes remained devoid of amusement. "Then do it. Bring her down." Because if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was this. No one rises without someone trying to pull them back down. At that moment, Sophie had no idea what was coming. Right now, she was simply savoring the rare moment when everything seemed truly okay, when she could look up at the evening sky without fear of tomorrow. She knew the world outside was harsh, that fame could be a double-edged sword. But she also knew that it didn't matter what others thought of her. What mattered was that she had made it, that she had fought, and that she had won. She had survived death, and now she would never let anyone decide her fate again. That morning, as the early sunlight streamed through the window and the first golden rays cast their glow upon her desk, Sophie was carefully going through a backlog of orders when an unassuming envelope, simple, unadorned, yet carrying an invisible weight, was placed at her doorstep. There was no postage mark, no indication of any standard courier service, just a cream-colored envelope, her name written neatly on the front in bold, deliberate handwriting. Sophie picked it up with care, her fingers running lightly along the paper's edge. A part of her already sensed that this was no ordinary letter. Slowly, she opened the envelope and pulled out a meticulously written note. The words on the page made her heart pound instantly. Sophie, the first time I saw your paintings, I didn't just see colors and brushstrokes. I saw your story. I saw the strength inside you. I saw the way you refused to surrender to adversity. I have spent my life in a world of giants, a world where strength is measured in muscle, in physical dominance. But you reminded me that true strength doesn't lie there. It lies in the spirit. Not everyone understands that. Not everyone has the perseverance to fight, even when everything is against them. But you did, and I know you will go even further. Never stop fighting. Shaquille O'Neal. Sophie read the words over and over again, each sentence engraving itself into her mind. A surge of emotion welled up inside her, not just because this was a letter from one of the greatest people she had ever admired, but because he had truly seen her. Not just as a girl selling paintings on the sidewalk, not as a fleeting headline in the news, but as a fighter, as someone carving her own path forward. She took a deep breath, gripping the letter tightly in her hands, feeling as if it were a tangible reminder that her journey was not just about surviving an illness, not just about selling art or gaining recognition. It was about proving that she could create something greater than herself. But no matter what Sophie felt in that moment, she had no idea that elsewhere someone was watching her. Someone who had been waiting for this very moment, their dark plan already set in motion. He had been patient. He knew that every rising story had a weakness, a tiny flaw that, if exploited correctly, could bring everything crashing down in an instant. And now, he had the weapon he needed. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face as his fingers glided over the phone screen, tapping on a file just sent from an anonymous source. "You've climbed so high, little girl, so fast, but let's see if you can hold on." He hit send, and within minutes a new storm began to form. A year had passed, but for Sophie Carter, every single day since she left the hospital felt like a gift she never thought she would receive. A year ago, she was just a girl sitting on a sidewalk, battling illness and hopelessness, selling small paintings with the faint hope of covering her medical bills. But today, she was standing in the middle of a magnificent room, where the lights illuminated her paintings in a way she had only ever dreamed of before. Her first art exhibition. She stood still before the large glass doors, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The paintings hung neatly on the walls, each one carrying a piece of her soul, reflecting everything she had been through, the deep emotions she had never dared to express in words. They were no longer just sitting on a folding table on the sidewalk. They were here, in an elegant space, where every gaze upon them was filled with genuine appreciation. The guests had arrived, moving slowly between the artworks, speaking in hushed tones, art lovers, collectors, and even people who had only recently heard about her through news stories. But regardless of who they were, they all had one thing in common. They saw her. A familiar voice rang out from behind her, deep and steady. "You've come a long way, Sophie." She turned around, and even though she knew he was coming, seeing Shaquille O'Neal standing in her exhibition still brought an emotional smile to her lips. Shaq stood there, still exuding the same strong presence, but instead of the black hoodie and sweatpants he had worn the first time they met, today he was dressed in a sharp suit. His keen eyes swept across the room before settling on a familiar painting displayed prominently in the center. The first painting she ever sold. She didn't even need to look to know which one it was. A vast desert landscape where a lone figure stood beneath a sky filled with gusting winds, the sunset stretching across the sand. The painting Shaq had bought that day. The painting that now belonged to his private collection. I used to be so afraid that I wouldn't be able to keep painting. But if it weren't for this piece, if it weren't for that day, I wouldn't be standing here, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Shaq studied the painting for a long moment before turning back to her. His gaze held no pity, no self-congratulatory pride for having helped her, just recognition. Sometimes, a single moment can change an entire life. But what matters most is whether the person in that moment has the courage to seize it. Sophie's throat tightened. She had never thought of it that way before. But he was right. Shaq might have bought the painting. But if she hadn't had the resilience to keep fighting, to keep painting, to turn that opportunity into something bigger, then it all would have been just another fleeting social media story, another momentary phenomenon forgotten in weeks. But she hadn't let that happen. Still, despite achieving more success than she had ever imagined, Sophie couldn't forget that not everyone wanted to see her succeed. The media storm after Shaq's purchase didn't just bring good things. It also brought rumors, negative articles, and people who twisted her story into something more sensational, more controversial. Some articles insinuated that her story was fabricated to elicit sympathy. Some people spread rumors that she hadn't actually needed money for treatment, that all the donations she received had been misused. Some even created evidence to claim that she had deceived everyone. At first, she had been terrified. She didn't know how to fight back against these attacks, didn't know how to defend herself against a world where one false rumor could destroy everything she had worked for. But then, she realized something. The people who truly mattered to her, the ones who truly believed in her, never doubted her for even a second. And in that moment, she understood that she had nothing to fear. Because in the end, the truth was still the truth. And what she had done, what she had overcome, no one could take that away from her. And now, standing in the middle of her first ever art exhibition, surrounded by paintings and people who genuinely loved her art, Sophie knew that she had won. Not just against the illness, not just against those who tried to tear her down, but against the fear that had haunted her for so many years. She lifted her head, met Shaq's gaze, and smiled, without hesitation this time. "Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." He simply nodded, a small smile playing at his lips before turning his attention back to the painting once more. In that moment, Sophie knew that her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. From a girl selling paintings on a sidewalk, Sophie Carter had fought through a devastating illness, survived the weight of financial struggles, and emerged as a true artist, recognized by one of the greatest legends, Shaquille O'Neal. A single moment had changed her entire life, but the most important thing was Sophie's own courage. She never gave up, she dared to seize the opportunity, and she turned it into something extraordinary. Her story is proof that in life there will always be challenges that seem impossible to overcome. But as long as we refuse to give up, as long as we keep pushing forward, miracles will find us in ways we never expected. What about you? Have you ever experienced a moment that changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.